So good morning. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. I would like to welcome all of you to today's conversation on COVID, Brexit, and the debate on Scottish independence. We are organizing this event in cooperation with our partner university in Scotland, the University of St. Andrews, and also with the support of the San Francisco chapter of the St. Andrews Society that has been generously sponsoring the focus on Scotland at our Institute of European Studies. I should also mention that today's event is co-organized with our Center for British Studies and with the Anglo-American Law and Policy program on the UC Berkeley campus. Today's event will be moderated by my colleague Mark Bevere, who's a professor in political science here at Berkeley and who is also the director of our Center for British Studies, as well as Kevin Orr, professor of leadership and governance at the University of St. Andrews and a senior fellow at our Institute of European Studies here in Berkeley. I should also mention my colleague Julia Nelson, who will be moderating this event behind the scenes. For today's event, we have three distinguished speakers. We have with us today BBC correspondent Alan Little, who's a specialist in foreign affairs, who has received many awards for his journalism, including the Amnesty International Reporter of the Year. Alan is a good friend of our institute. We had the pleasure of welcoming Alan several times to the Berkeley campus, and we're proud to count him among our team of senior fellows at the institute. So welcome, Alan. Good to see you. We also welcome Kirstine Shields, who is a human rights law expert and a lecturer in international law and food security at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, Kirstine. And our third speaker is Fergus Neville, who is a lecturer in organizational studies in the School of Management at the University of St. Andrews. Fergus is currently co-investigator on a research project entitled Facilitating the Public Response to COVID-19. So a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to joining us today. The way things will work is that Mark and Kevin will alternate questions for about 30 minutes. And in the second part of the event, we will pass on questions sent to us from the audience via the chat room. So during the first half of the conversation, all of you in the audience are encouraged to write down your own questions in the chat function on Zoom. And my colleague, Julia Nelson, will then be passing on a selection of these questions to our moderators in the second part of the conversation. I do want to ask you all to mute yourself and also to turn off your personal videos for the quality of the screening during the event. Allow me now to pass on the floor to Kevin Orr from the University of St. Andrews for the first question. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeroen, for that perfect introduction and echoing your thanks to IES, its partners and sponsors for making the event possible. It's important we hear from our panellists, but just the briefest bit of context, I think, for the seminar and for the conversation. So Scotland is, like everywhere else, more than 12 months into the pandemic. It is 2 months into the post-Brexit world, and it's also just over 2 months away from returning to the polls for the elections to the Scottish Parliament in May, at a point when polling for independence has been in the majority for a sustained period of months. So it seemed to us timely to have our discussion today and have this conversation today. And as you've just outlined, Jeroen, we have an excellent panel who are well positioned to guide us through the issues, both the nuances of the Scottish scene and the bigger picture. So the first question from me, at least by way of scene setting at the start of the conversation, I turn to Alan Little, distinguished journalist, writer, broadcaster and close observer of Scotland. Alan, in 2014, which was of course pre-Brexit and pre-Covid, Scotland voted 55% to 45% on an 86% turnout to remain part of the United Kingdom. As we speak today, polling suggests there has been a significant shift towards support for independence. And I wonder what you think explains that shift, Alan.
Well, there are probably three things. The first is a lot of this is age driven. The further down the age demographic you go, the more likely you are to find people who support independence. And people of my generation, people at age 55 to 65, can remember when Britain was very popular in Scotland, because there were great pan-British enterprises that were central parts of everyday life, the nationalised industries, coal, steel, shipbuilding, and so on. And there was a real sense of British solidarity across the whole United Kingdom in those communities. But if you're under the age of 40 now, you've got no memory of those at all, not even a childhood memory of them. So something of the glue that's been holding Britain together has been stripped away over the last 40 years or so. Secondly, Brexit is a very, very significant factor in this. And what's happened over the last 6 years is gradually people have been moving in both directions. A lot of Remain supporters who voted no in 2014 because they didn't want to be partly because they didn't want to be outside the European Union, have now made the journey to yes to independence. And there is a convergence of yes independence sentiment with Remain sentiment. But there's been movement in the other direction as well. People who voted for independence in 2014 but voted to leave the EU have moved to the no camp. But the first of those is by far the more significant. So yeah, you're right. For the first time in history, there's a sustained, over about a year now, lead for independence. But the third thing is Boris Johnson, who's deeply unpopular in Scotland. His approval rating in a YouGov poll earlier this month was -52, and Nicola Sturgeon's approval rating was +23, and that's partly due to the pandemic. Her handling of the pandemic is compared to Boris Johnson's in Scotland, and is widely perceived to be much, much better. It's strange though, because at the beginning a lot of the same mistakes were made in both capitals, Edinburgh and London. But she is by all available evidence much, much more trusted to deliver a competent, clear, coherent public message. And I think those things have been, that partly accounts for her enhanced an already strong standing with the public. But I think that accounts too for why it is that independent sentiment is now regularly polling a majority.
Thanks, Alan. That's a really useful scene-setting overview for us, and sets up a lot of themes that I think we'll return to in the conversation. It's going to work by Mark Beaver and I just passing the baton between ourselves for the first part of the seminar. So over to you, Mark. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll pick up on that. So 62% of Scottish voters voted to stay within the EU. And as you said, Alan, it does look as though there's a pro-EU aspect to the growing sympathies for independence. And sitting on the other side of the pond, I'm wondering how much discussion there is in Scotland about the extent to which leaving the UK would actually be followed by entering the European Union. Are people very sanguine about that? Do they think that countries like Spain and Italy will have a problem with admitting a state that has just evolved from a larger state? After all, Spain must be thinking about its vast population, Italy about its North separatists. I can imagine an awful lot of European countries thinking they would rather not admit a state that has just succeeded from another, albeit through the polls. Are these sort of issues discussed in Scotland, or is there just a kind of sanguine faith that once they leave the UK, they'll readily be accepted into the EU?
Do you want me to tackle that, Mark?
Sorry, I think that perhaps yes, to start with, but perhaps we could have a norm that any of the three panelists who want to comment on any question come in successively. So perhaps start with Alan, and then either Fergus or Kirsten, if they want to come in, could do so afterwards.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. It's a great question, and I think the answer is no. We haven't really begun to have that debate, that conversation yet in Scotland. The assumption is an independent Scotland would go back into the EU. The other debate we need to have is whether, no matter how you feel, no matter how strongly you favour European Union membership, whether it would be wise for an independent Scotland, at least in the short term, to be a member of the EU, which would set up a land border with England. And I think there are certainly some people in the SNP who are saying, well, to begin with, for the first few years anyway, as well as sharing the currency with England, we would have to share be part of a customs union with the rest of the United Kingdom, because erecting a land border with England would be highly problematic, and certainly in the short term, it's a major impediment to joining the EU. So no, we haven't begun to have that conversation, and that would be something that would be very, very highly charged in any referendum campaign. So it's a good question.
Can I come in briefly there? So I think one additional argument that supporters of independence might make is that in the 2014 campaign, it made sense for countries like Spain to say, if Scotland leaves the UK and therefore the EU, we won't vote for you to come back in. But I think the situation here is slightly different in that Scotland has been, in the words of the SNP, has been dragged out of the EU against its will, because Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU while the UK voted to leave. And so the situation, perhaps, if Scotland were then to become independent, to then apply to the EU, is a slightly different context to what we saw in 2014.
I would just add to that the mechanism is there is potentially precedent for the mechanism for rejoining through a reverse Greenland situation. The main difference, as Alan points out, though, is that we aren't a borderless state. We aren't an island state, unlike Greenland and Denmark. So the logistics may well put a freeze on the aspiration.
But this is also why, Mark, it's so important to Nicola Sturgeon to do it legally and constitutionally. That's why it's so important to her to have an article, the so-called Article 30 order from Westminster, so it can be done in consensus with Westminster. And she's under increasing pressure. There's a split in the SNP, which has become very, very bitter in recent months, with many on the more radical wing seeing her as too cautious, too constitutional, too willing to wait for Westminster's approval before pressing ahead with a second referendum. But she knows what happened in Catalonia, and she keeps reminding her more impatient SNP members that although they went ahead with a referendum, it didn't deliver independence. And so she wants to do it constitutionally, and that is now getting her into more and more trouble with the more radical wings of her party. She wants to be able to go to European capitals and say, we did this under the authority of the United Kingdom Constitution, and we agreed the process with London, and we all agreed to recognise the outcome. And as long as Westminster continues to hold out, as Boris Johnson insists he will, though there will be no second referendum, she's under growing pressure to come up with a more radical plan B.
Can I quickly follow up on that? Do you all think then that it's a mistake for Sturgeon and for nationalists more generally not to be having discussions, public discussions already about where they would go after independence? I can imagine that if those discussions don't happen now, when voters are asked to vote, they will look at a situation where there's no guarantee they'll get into the European Union. And they risk, as Alan was saying, having a land border with the UK, with the rest of what's left of the UK, which were also England, Wales, Northern Ireland, which would be very detrimental to trade relationships. My judgment would be that those issues are best addressed before an independence vote. So rather than allowing them to fester and then suddenly arise as something that would scare people in the actual context of a vote and a debate and a referendum.
I'm sure there would be another white paper put out which would address some of these core issues, but we can't preempt that. We can't, you know.
Thanks, Christine, and sticking with you because we're on the subject of Brexit, Christine Shields, and that's something that you've been looking at recently through the lens of human rights. And I wonder if you could say something about that. Would independence change Scotland's approach to human rights? Could you give a little bit of insight into the work that you've been doing on that issue, and whether or not this issue of human rights post-Brexit and in an independence world or within a UK world, whether that would play into the political conversation about independence or not?
Thanks, Kevin. Well, the first thing I'd say is that I'm a little bit removed from my work on on constitution and governance structures. The most recent piece will come out in a book called Scotland's Next Decision, which is an edited volume curated by the Centre for Constitutional Change and led by Eve Hepburn and Nicola McEwen. And in that piece, I talk about two trends towards human rights. So reframing rights as processes rather than events or rather than accomplishments or entitlements, but thinking of processes towards human rights and processes away from human rights. And in that regard, I think that you can see Brexit as part of a wider trend with a wider trend reflected in the ideology of the UK government about liberal states and maximising freedom and removing oversight institutions, also perhaps dismantling internal institutions. And we've seen, for instance, DFID has been a casualty of that very early on. So in terms of will Brexit affect human rights?
Yeah.
There's lots of layers to that question. The first one being technically, well, leaving the EU is not quite the same as leaving the ECHR. We will lose our link with the European Charter, and that provides a lot of social and also consumer rights. But the ECHR is considered to be much more, the holy grail of the European human rights movement. That remains in place. However, leaving the EU does make repealing that relationship easier. And the UK government has not been shy about signalling its desire to leave the ECHR. The Human Rights Act is currently under review. There's a call for evidence on the Human Rights Act, and the mood is very much that is for revision. So it certainly will affect human rights, one way or the other.
So I suppose that's very helpful, and I suppose that one danger might be of a kind of double hit or a double whammy, as we would say colloquially, in terms of human rights, that Brexit has the potential at least to reduce our human rights obligation, but simultaneously in terms of economic or other impacts, it might increase the need to put in further protections, and it's interesting to anticipate which way that might go.
Absolutely. So we're in a time of change. We're in a time of economic upheaval. COVID has highlighted our interconnectedness, the need for universal human rights, and it's perhaps the worst time to be removing these basic guarantees of the state. I would also say, and I think I go into this in this very short piece for this edited volume, that removing the connection with ECHR has a bigger impact on the UK than it would have, for instance, a state like France or other European nations which have strong constitutions, written constitutions. the UK doesn't have a written constitution. The ECHR has filled a constitutional vacuum to a large extent. In Scotland, we have the Scotland Act, which brings in some of those guarantees. So we have this kind of quasi-constitutional act, but removing the link with the ECHR has a bigger impact than it would have in other European states, and that's partly because of the constitutional design, that we don't have one written document. As Jack Straw said, you would be hard pushed to put your finger on what your rights are in the UK. And whether that's a design feature or a design flaw depends on whether you've had to rely on such a document to protect your rights. So it has a double whammy. It has a stronger effect, and that's partly why it was chased so hard. And the other whammy is from other factors at play right now: the pandemic, and also the climate challenges that are coming our way. Mm-hmm.
That's good, Kirstine. Thanks very much. And I'll pass back to Mark Beaver.
So talking of the pandemic, Fergus has been doing some work on the social psychology of COVID, and I'll be interesting to hear his reflections on how it's gone, and in particular differences between Scotland and Britain. I mean, trust in Nicola Sturgeon and her handling of the pandemic seems very high in Scotland, whereas the opposite, I think, is true of Boris in England. And I wonder what general explanations there are for that in terms of the cohesiveness of society, the sheer competence of the respective politicians, the different health systems in the countries. I mean, I don't know if people have been following the news, but only yesterday, Sturgeon outlined a much more cautious opening up programme from Boris over the next 3 months through April, May, etc. Fergus, would you like to give us your views on that?
Yeah, thanks. That's quite a question, Mark. Interestingly, it's not just in Scotland where Sturgeon has been seen as more competent than Johnson. So you got a poll in Scotland, we were asked which country has handled the pandemic better, is it Scotland or England? And in Scotland, we say 76% Scotland and 7% England. But in the UK as a whole, the answer still comes out as a majority, 52% Scotland, 10% England. So it's not just a Scottish perception, it's actually UK-wide. Yeah, with colleagues, I've been looking at the role of social identity processes in the pandemic. And they're really important for a variety of reasons. If you're trying to affect mass behaviour change, you need to be able to mobilise people through a shared group identity, and nationhood is quite an effective way of doing that because it's a social category in which people identify with. If people are thinking in terms of their personal identities, okay, or in terms of identities like maybe as students or something, that can be quite problematic because if you are a low-risk individual, then being told to self-isolate or not to work and things, you might balance that up and say, well, personally, I'm at low risk from infection and I'm at low risk of serious illness and death, and therefore actually it makes more sense for me to meet up with my friends or to go out, go on holiday or something like that. So what the strategy needs to be, I think, from those in power is to try to make salient to people a much more collective identity, okay, to get people to think in terms of we, not I, because then that collective identity includes vulnerable members of your community who you care about, then people will change their behaviours. The next question then, if you're getting people to think in terms of we rather than I, is who is we, right? Who counts as we? And that's where there's a battle going on. So in Scotland, the Scottish government tried to get people to think in terms of being Scots. So if you see the public health campaigns, a lot of them say, hashtag we are Scotland, we look out for one another, that kind of thing. Now, the strategy in England has been a little bit different. I mean, these are broad generalizations, but in England, instead of trying to exert power through the group, there's been a general trend towards power over the group. where there have been sort of commands, you must do this, with threats of enforcement and fines, imprisonment, and so forth. And that can actually fragment the social group, because it breaks the illusion of we're all in this together, we are on your side, if one group is telling the other what to do. And I think, in particular, the Cummings scandal, which I'll explain for a little bit for our American friends. So this was Boris Johnson's top advisor, who was widely seen as flouting the very COVID guidelines, which he and the government had been espousing, and Boris Johnson backed him. And again, that was generally seen as because he was his advisor rather than not recognising it was the right thing to do. But what happened is that overnight, the trust in the UK government dropped by 19%. And that's because it broke the illusion of we. Okay, it was no longer seen as the public and the government all in this together to tackle the pandemic. It was much more seen as one rule for us and one rule for them. And I think that's really damaged the image of the UK's approach to COVID, where I think the Scottish government's approach generally has been more successful in sort of trying to unite the nation in a more cohesive way to tackle the pandemic.
Can I add something to the politics of that, Mark? That's very interesting. I hadn't heard that before, but it completely makes sense. One of the differences, Scotland's death rate has been about 130 per 100,000, which is very bad compared to international in the international context. But the UK's death rate has been about 180 per 100,000. So that is a significant gap. That's partly luck. It's partly because the virus was much less further advanced at the beginning, a year ago, through the population. But it's also partly as a result of the way in which the public policy diverged from about May last year, when the nations started to adopt different policies and go at different speeds. And so Nicola Sturgeon has been credited with that. One of Boris Johnson's great skills as a political campaigner is an ability to project optimism. People call it pejoratively boosterism, and it works. You can talk up a market, you can talk up an election, electorates are susceptible to this. Virus is not, and what happened for the first few weeks is that the UK government was perceived in Scotland, but elsewhere in the UK, I think, as setting unrealistic targets, making unrealistically optimistic projections, making unrealistic promises. And there was a period, quite an extended period, when the UK government seemed very, very desperate to announce something eye-catching to sell to the public. Whereas Nicola Sturgeon doggedly stood there day after day after day and said, look, this is really difficult. We're going to make mistakes. When we do, I'll try to level with you. And she wasn't guilty of boosterism. And I think that explains as well why trust in the UK government diminished quite quickly, whereas it didn't in the Scottish government. And the telling thing is, last summer, her approval rating on handling 82% said they thought she'd handled it well. Now that means that many people who are absolutely sworn enemies, not just of the SNP, but of independents, were prepared to give her credit for handling it. So her approval ate into a section of the community that is mortally opposed to the project that she's devoted her life to. And that is very telling. And but it's easier for her in a sense, because she doesn't have a lockdown skeptic wing of her party sitting on her back benches saying, when are you going to open up the economy? Whereas Boris Johnson has had to appease that sizable chunk of the Conservative Party, which overlaps, by the way, with the pro-Brexit support. And so he's had to manage those expectations in a way. There is no politically significant or powerful lockdown skeptic group in Scottish public life, the way there is in Westminster.
So, I mean, I would like to get a more general discussion and everyone involved. So please, the audience should feel free to add questions to chat. But on that front, on the COVID thing, I mean, a lot of the complaints about Boris Johnson, particularly coming out of people who wanted the economy opened up, was that the differences between different areas was ridiculously complex. So people living on one side of the street were in tier 4 and on another side of the street in tier 2. And I'm wondering to the extent to which Scotland managed to avoid that. And just to open it up, I also see that one of our audience has asked about human rights, what human rights in particular are under threat. And I'm wondering, specifically as a way of slightly reframing that question, what are the chances of the UK government removing a commitment to the European law on human rights from the British Constitution? Because it's actually included as part of the British law under the European Union. Is Brexit threatening that? Will the actual instantiation of these rights in UK law disappear along with Britain's membership of the European Union?
Well, I'll just come in on that last point. So the main embodiment of the rights is the Human Rights Act, and that doesn't create a new Charter of Rights. That refers to the ECHR. That says this is a process for interpreting the ECHR rights, and either we're going to send a piece of legislation back to Parliament for reconsideration, or as a court, we will declare this incompatible. So, and that is to say that the ECHR is incompatible with a UK piece of legislation. So it's quite far removed from thinking that you go to court and you rely on a piece of law to defend your rights. You go to court and you say, and you claim that there's a conflict of laws here, and does Parliament really mean to create this conflict, and can it resolve it? And if it says, actually, no, we do mean this, the Counter-Terrorism Act stands, the bedroom tax law stands, then the claimant has an option at present to take their case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So that's the pathway that exists at present. And if the Human Rights Act is removed, there's not the option to raise a complaint that there's a conflict of laws. But we don't have a British Charter of Human Rights. And we can go into the very limited protections that do come from the Magna Carta and so forth. But maybe tonight's not the night. But they're not very well developed rights. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Christine. That's really helpful. I'm picking up on the point about the different policy choices, the different communication strategies that several panellists have pointed us towards in Scotland as opposed to other parts of the UK. And I wonder about the impact that has on the independence debate. Is there something about the visibility of Scotland exercising different policy choices, engaging in different messaging, communicating differently about COVID that will have a kind of a longer impact upon people's sense of what's possible, what's feasible for Scotland politically?
I think so. If I can come in, the Scottish Parliament is now 22 years old. It'll turn 22 this year. Before that, Scotland was governed from Westminster. But in those 20 years, the devolved powers, the powers that pass from Westminster to the Holyrood Parliament in Edinburgh, have never been so visibly and publicly exercised as they have been over the last 12 months. The public can see in a very, very graphic and vivid way now how things are different in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. And I think it's been a wake-up, a gradual awakening as well for people, particularly in England, who I think have had a tendency to use the terms England and Britain as though they're the same thing. You can use England and Britain changeably in a way you couldn't possibly with Scotland and Britain, for example, or Wales and Britain. And I think there is every day in the public discourse now on the news programs and in the newspapers, there's reference to a four-nation approach, the four nations of the United Kingdom. So there is much greater consciousness now across the UK that this is not a unitary state anymore in the conventional sense. So yes, I think it has awakened in people who are inclined to support independence anyway, the tendency to see to see what has happened in Scotland over the last 12 months as the start of a great potential. And at the same time, among people disinclined to independence, to be nervous and worried about one family member of mine who's vehemently opposed to an independent Scotland grumbles to me all the time about why does Nicola Sturgeon feel she has to just be different for the sake of it? I don't think she is being different for the sake of it. She's being different when she's been different. She's been different for good reasons embedded in the data. When the data has been different in Scotland to the rest of the UK, she's adopted a different policy. And I think most people in Scotland can see that. And that a one size, and so it's led to questions generally about when a one size fits all solution has been imposed across the entire United Kingdom by Westminster. Immigration, for example, is a great example. There was a perception in large parts of England that there had been too much immigration, and that to some extent drove the Brexit vote. Well, Scotland's problem historically has not been too much immigration, but too much emigration. And so Scotland's population increases across the 20th century did not keep pace with the UK's but immigration remains a policy reserved to Westminster. So Scotland has imposed on it a policy that suits England, suits the UK as a whole, but is opposite to what Scotland really needs, which is to encourage more people of working age into the country to support the tax base, if nothing else. So I think awareness of that now has been enhanced by the way in which these powers are being so visibly and every day exercised in a way that directly affects people's lives. That's never happened before since the Scottish Parliament came into existence.
Can I pick up on that quickly as well? I mean, you can bet that the divergent approaches and apparent divergent successes or perceived successes during the pandemic will be used as a rhetorical resource, certainly by supporters of independence. They'll be able to say, you know, look how well we do when we stop following England. You know, when we take our own approach, we do much better. How much better would we have done if we were able to have done the thorough scheme ourselves rather than having to wait for England? Think how much better Scotland would have been if we closed the borders earlier rather than later. I mean, there's current different approaches in terms of flights in and that kind of thing as well. And in the sort of pro-UK camp, you'll have similar arguments. You know, you'll have people saying, well, Scotland was perhaps slower about getting the vaccine program off the ground, and so there was the offer of the British Army coming over to help Scotland roll out the vaccine, which was, you know, promptly refused by the Scottish government. That was seen as a trap. But these debates and these perceptions just now are really going to matter moving forward when it comes to what's seen as an inevitable independence campaign, if not referendum.
Yeah, the Scottish Conservatives are already using this, and what they want to highlight is what they're already calling the deep pockets of the UK Treasury, the deep pockets of the UK Treasury that could fund the furlough scheme and the business support schemes and the self-employed support schemes and so on. The nationalists have yet to respond to that by saying, well, look, Denmark doesn't have the deep pockets of the UK Treasury. Sweden's probably a bad example. Finland doesn't have the deep pockets of the UK Treasury. And they've yet to make the argument with any real strength that independent countries have deep pockets of their own if they have control of their own macroeconomic policy. So I think, yeah, there are arguments on both sides, but it's already started to penetrate the rhetoric of the debate.
I'm wondering too, to what extent it foreshadows, if not independence, also a stretching of greater distance between Scottish and British affairs, so Scotland and the rest of Britain. I mean, even if we're not talking about independence, to what extent might Scotland and the Scottish Parliament start to exert a policy powers that make a sharper difference with the UK? I mean, historically, the Scottish legal system has always been distinct from the English legal system. So you can imagine the Scottish legal system going its own way. And I might be wrong about this, but I think I'm right in saying, you probably all know more about this than me, that since devolution, the two policy areas in which Scotland has particularly distanced itself from the rest of the UK, particularly England, but also to a lesser extent Wales and Northern Ireland, have been health and education. And would the success of that distancing in health during the pandemic give the Scottish Parliament a kind of sense of moral authority or political urgency to also develop greater distancing from UK policies or British policies or English policies in other areas, do you think? Anyone?
Yeah, all right. So I like the question, and I think that this has been a way that the Scottish Government has tried to distinguish itself. But I do wonder if we're kind of looking at looking too hard to find differences in that approach. And with the pandemic, I think the real lessons are about Western approaches and Eastern approaches. And the real lessons are coming from East Asian states where the death rates were much lower. And that certainly speaks to the cultural confidence issues that Fergus raised, the cultural confidence and the quality of governance. And that is certainly about institutions and obedience to institutions, belief in institutions, and strong state institutions. If the pandemic had occurred half a century earlier, we would be looking at a reverse situation. The West would have the strong institutions and strong obedience, and Eastern states may not have such strong internal institutions. So we can split hairs on Scotland and England, but maybe someone else would like to discuss that.
Yeah, I'll pick it up if you like. I mean, I think what critics of the SNP government have been in power, remember, since 2007. It's a long time for, and they're going to win massively in May as well, the parliamentary elections. They're sitting at 55% in the opinion polls for the constituency section, which will see them take nearly every seat in Scotland. The Conservatives are second on something like 22 or 23%. That's a massive gap. And that's partly because they can, although they're in government, they can also be in opposition, because they are the main opposition to the Conservative government in London. But what critics would say was that in health and education in particular, we've been living in a policy vacuum, a public policy vacuum in Scotland, driven by a reluctance to engage in the kind of radical reform which might be unpopular in the short term, because the government's priority is to secure independence and doesn't want to alienate a large constituency, like, for example, healthcare workers or school teachers. And I mean, one doctor I know here, when England and Wales were having a dispute with the junior doctors, there was a junior doctor strike for a time in England. I said to a doctor I know here, why have we not got a dispute with our junior doctors? And he said, well, we've got all the same problems in our health service. We're just not trying to fix them. Now, you could, regardless of your position on the changes that the then health secretary in England was trying to make, he was at least trying to fix the problems. It was very unpopular with healthcare workers, whereas in Scotland there was a reluctance to go too deep, too far, to alienate all the school teachers in the country and put them off independence, to alienate all the nurses or all the doctors in the country. So that's what critics level at the SNP government all the time. You're too feared. You're too feared to engage in public policies which are short term, which are unpopular in the short term, but which might fix the entrenched problems in the long term.
Yeah, so we have this oddity, don't we, in Scotland at the moment, that we're much less likely to get the virus in Scotland than in other parts of the UK, but you're in big trouble if you do happen to contract the virus, and that points to some underlying inequalities and issues that haven't yet been addressed.
That's right. Over recent weeks, Scotland's infection rate has sometimes been less than half the UK average. So you're less likely to get the virus in Scotland, but if you do get it, you're more likely to die. And Fergus probably knows more about this than I do, and that's because of the poorer public health generally in Scotland. And again, that's a devolved matter. Scottish people tend to be, there's more obesity, there's more diabetes, there's more smoking-related health problems, alcohol-related health problems per head of population in Scotland than the UK average. So yeah, you are more likely to die in Scotland if you do catch the virus, although you're less likely to catch it.
Thank you. Perhaps this is a good time to work our way through a few of the questions that audience members have been kind enough to post, and maybe just scroll backwards and see how many we can tackle between us. But the most recent post from Jeroen is, could the panel address the question of how or whether problems in Northern Ireland and aftermath of Brexit have influenced the debate and the conversation on independence in Scotland? The issue of borders came up earlier in the conversation. I wonder what the panel's reflection on the lessons from Northern Ireland post-Brexit have for conversations about independence.
Should I have a go at that then? I mean, at the beginning, the Scottish government were arguing that if Northern Ireland can stay in the customs union and a single market, then why can't Scotland? So it was seen, and oddly, some members of the government in London have been arguing that Northern Ireland's got the best of both worlds. It stays in the United Kingdom, but it remains part of the biggest trading bloc in the world, which would suggest that the arguments in favour of Brexit are rendered null and void by that. But I don't think it's cut through very strongly here. I think it's seen as, I think the expectation on the pro-independence side is that it will drive Northern Ireland eventually to unity with the rest of Ireland, and that it's part of the long, slow unravelling of the British project, part of the long, slow dissolution of the four-nation entity called the United Kingdom. So, and I think certainly on the unionist side, there's concern about that too. And again, it may be demographically driven in Northern Ireland. In the years that lie ahead, there's likely to be more support for United Ireland, driven again by demographics. But Fergus probably knows more about this.
No, I agree with you, Alan. I think, I mean, there's the sort of complex customs arguments, which maybe cut through a little bit, but not to a huge extent. But I see it probably having more of an impact on Irish independence, and then perhaps eventually, depending on the timeline, maybe on Scottish independence. But Scotland might go first. But I agree. I think certainly in the short term, it's more likely to have an impact in Ireland.
So I think that's right. I think we are, I mean, maybe it won't happen for a long time, but I think we are witnessing the slow unraveling of the United Kingdom as an entity. In a way, I think that's been made a bit harder actually by Brexit, albeit Northern Ireland offers a symbol of a different way, but in some ways I think Brexit has made it a bit harder, and I think people aren't sufficiently aware of that. And I think the underlying drive, this is reflecting a question from Marlene Wilson, the underlying drive to that unravelling is in a way social concerns and social differences between the four nations. And Marlene asks, how important is the social argument for independence versus the economic one? And are economic issues actually more difficult to make a case for independence on those grounds?
Yeah, you're right, Mark. It makes it not a bit more difficult, it makes it a lot more difficult. The great paradox of Brexit is it makes Scottish independence more likely, but much more difficult, because it raises questions that weren't there in 2014, like the border with England. But I see a parallel, a very strong parallel with the 1980s, which I remember from, I was a student at the beginning of the 1980s. That was when I moved into the workforce. Scotland voted very strongly against Conservative governments, but got them anyway because it was part of the United Kingdom. Scotland did not want to walk the path laid out by Margaret Thatcher, that radical reforming government. Scotland voted against it again and again and again, but had to walk the path because it was part of the United Kingdom. Well, today Scotland doesn't want to walk the Brexit path either, but has to walk the Brexit path because it's part of the United Kingdom. The effect of the Thatcher years was to turn a lukewarm support for a devolution project in 1979, didn't really get off the ground, into a rock solid 3-1 majority for a primary legislative Scottish Parliament 18 years later. And I suspect that in the years ahead, Brexit will have a similar effect on Scotland's attitude to its place in the Union, a similar effect to that, to its attitude to independence. And I think that remains the direction of travel. what we haven't yet done is have a proper grown-up conversation about the difficulties that will put in place. But, you know, we have a proper grown-up conversation about the difficulties we face with Brexit. But in the end, people voted for, people voted for Brexit despite all the warnings that came from many people saying it would cause economic problems. So yeah, I think Brexit is will affect the future of the United Kingdom very, very profoundly, the internal structure of the United Kingdom very profoundly.
Would any of the three of you like to comment specifically on the economic things? Because it does seem to me that one of the areas where Brexit, because of course Brexit is it's an example of a social division. Many more people in England were in favour of leave and many more people in Scotland in favour of remain. But the economics of Brexit seem to me again to be one of the things that makes independence harder to conceive of. I mean, Scotland's economic ties are to England. Of course, it has ties to European Union, but by far and away, the main trading partner of Scotland is England. And if you face the Scottish economy with a straightforward choice of maintaining trade with England or maintaining trade with the European Union, it would seem, at least at the moment, that Scotland would do much better to maintain trade with England. So again, this is an example of Marlene's question, I think, about the economic issues. Does Scotland need to find a way of somehow negotiating independence so that it can maintain an open trade with both, or at least with England? I think these are issues that illustrate how Brexit has made the economic case for independence even harder, albeit that it makes the social and cultural case for independence even easier to make.
Let me just, I'll jump in because this is quite important. One of the things that the SNP has failed to break through on is the argument about why Scotland runs a public spending deficit, a current account deficit as big as it does. And because actually the only part of the United Kingdom that is in surplus in this sense, that raises more in taxes than it spends in public spending, is the southeast corner of the country. And the question, why does Scotland need a subsidy, in effect, from, although Scottish nationalists would take issue with that, from the UK Treasury? What is it about the way the United Kingdom is governed that makes the only truly dynamic and wealth-creating part of the country, the southeast corner of England, and everybody else dependent on redistributive policies? Denmark doesn't require redistributive income from fiscal transfer from Germany. Norway doesn't require one from Sweden. Why does Scotland require one from England? And the nationalist answer to that question is, if you have control of your own macroeconomic policy, you can tailor your macroeconomic policy to the specific needs of the country you're governing and promote growth. I was having a conversation once in Finland a few years ago with an IT entrepreneur, and I said to him, what would the economy of Finland look like if it was still in a union with Sweden and your macroeconomic policy was set by a parliament in Stockholm? And he rolled his eyes and said, well, Nokia would still be making rubber boots. We'd have a provincial economy dependent on a large fiscal transfer from the capital. But because we've been independent for 100 years, we can have a macroeconomic policy tailored to our needs and not those of a much larger neighbor. So that argument has never been successfully articulated, I think, by nationalist leaders. So they remain open to the charge that they're taking a country with a large public sector deficit away from a state within which it enjoys a fiscal transfer. That's not the trade question. I'll let somebody else tackle that.
Just to say on trade, I don't have the data to hand, and it's not something that I'm engaged with right now, but there is a little bit of a misconception about trade and about England being Scotland's greatest trading partner. Much of that trade is then exported to Rotterdam and then distributed throughout the rest of the world. So it's also a question of ports, not actually exchange of goods. And part of the key strategy or a key move that would be made if Scotland was to become independent would be to open ports again in the north. But in terms of export capacity and export goods, Scotland exports apparently 6,000 more per head than the rest of the UK. So Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? I'm conscious I don't want to hog it, but I want to add one thing, Mark. And it's the comparison with Ireland. Until the 1950s, virtually 100% of Ireland's exports were to Great Britain. I'm talking about the Republic of Ireland. Britain and Ireland went into the European project together in 1973. And since then, Ireland's dependence on Britain as an export destination has steadily fallen. And now it exports about 15% of its exports come to Britain, and the rest predominantly go to the European Union. And Ireland's experience of European integration, and this is true of many of the smaller nations, is not that pooling your sovereignty in this way compromises or diminishes your sovereignty. To some extent, it enhances it by getting you out from under the shadow of a much more powerful, historically big neighbor with whom you're locked in a kind of symbiotic relationship. So, and similarly, Ireland has successfully formed alliances in Europe with other small nations with similar interests. And the small nation experience of Europe has been that it doesn't diminish your sovereignty, it enhances it, because it makes you much, much less dependent on your one big neighbor. And that's a very attractive, that's a very appealing, intriguing thing for the pro-independence movement to grapple with, because what's happening is out there, among young people, they are looking across the North Sea at this constellation of very successful Northwest European states, about the same size as Scotland. Denmark's the same size. Finland's even smaller than Scotland. Norway's smaller than Scotland. Sweden is about nearly twice the size, but again, similar size. And the young in particular say, those social democratic states, those ones that prioritize egalitarianism, we like that. We'd like to be like that. And don't underestimate the extent to which the pro-independence sentiment is driven not by identity, not by the flag, not by some kind of ethnic self-identity, but by the social justice agenda, by the idea that Scotland could be a fairer country, more egalitarian country. That's what's giving rocket fuel to the independence movement, not conventionally nationalist sentiment. And that's a very hard thing, I think, for pro-union people to stigmatize and deal with.
If I could just come in there briefly.
Yeah.
Very, very, very briefly. Yeah.
Very briefly.
So I agree with that, Alan, although I would say that you can't just reduce identity to sort of the flag-waving nationalists as such. I mean, I would argue that the social justice agenda, being socially democratic, being internationalist in outlook, is part of the social identity of many Scots. So I think it depends how you define it. I know that wasn't what you were saying, but I think it's kind of an important point in terms of what it is to be Scottish, what that kind of that social, the content, the normative content of social of being Scottish, I think is slightly misperceived outside, particularly aware of our American audience here, where the independence campaign is not necessarily everyone in kilts waving their flags and so forth, but it is seen as a social movement.
Thank you. On that image of the flag waving, kilt sporting Scots, we have to draw it to a close. The clock's against us. I know it's a conversation that's going to continue, and hopefully it's been timely to have it in this way today, a little over 2 months from the elections, and perhaps we can circle back once the dust settles and look again at the Scottish picture. But it's been really enlightening to be guided through the detail of a lot of the terrain, as well as look at the wider picture. So thank you to each of the panellists for the thoughtful and engaging way in which you have shared your knowledge and expertise with us during this seminar. For my part, in closing, I'd like to thank Jeroen and Julia and Gia and all at the IES and its affiliates for their work in organising today's event, and to our friends at the St Andrews Society of San Francisco for their encouragement and support in putting together this Scottish-themed seminar. A huge thanks to everyone who has come along to participate and post questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get through all of those questions this time around, but enormous thanks to our amazing panel members. So that's Alan Little, Dr. Christine Shields of the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Fergus Neville of the University of St Andrews. And briefly, I'll hand you back to my colleague Mark Beaver for the final word. Thank you.
So I'll just echo the thanks to everyone, and particularly thank you to our audience. Obviously, the audience is what makes it all worthwhile. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice.